Hello, I did promise I would make a video with some hints and tips on how to engrave a portrait onto glass. Now, I asked all of my family if they would sit to let me do a portrait of them, and they all said no. So instead of that, what I did was I went to find a photo of actually Severiano Ballesteros, one of the greatest European golfers of all time, and I have engraved his photograph as an example to use for this video. I'm sure you'll understand that I've put myself out there a little bit in doing that, because if I had engraved a photo of Great Auntie Mabel, you wouldn't know whether it looked like her or not, but many of you will recognise Sevi. So please be kind to me. I've also added his signature, which I've picked out in a little bit of gold here. And my next video is going to cover how I add colour into engraving. But for today, we'll have a look at the process of engraving a portrait onto glass. Now, I'm going to have to edit this video a little bit differently from the way I usually do them. Normally, I try to show the process in chronological order from the beginning to the end, but I've got so much video from engraving the portrait that it just wouldn't be practical to do that. So instead, what I'll try to do is pick those pieces of video which illustrate the point that I'm trying to cover at that point in time. So, sometimes you'll see the engraving right at the beginning, sometimes it'll be at the end, sometimes it'll be in the middle, but the bits of video will hopefully help to make clear what I'm trying to say at the time, and I hope that's not too confusing for you. What I should say, and this applies to all of the videos I make, what I'm demonstrating is obviously how I do a portrait, but you will likely have your own style, which may be completely different from mine. But hopefully you may be able to pick up some tips from this video which will help you to go ahead and work in your own style of engraving. So, having said that, let's get started on the engraving. Whenever you're thinking about engraving a portrait on glass, the first step is probably going to be selecting a photograph to work from. Now, normally I would say to you, you should try to get the clearest, most detailed photograph to work from that you can find. I've broken that rule very much in this example because I particularly wanted to engrave this very iconic pose of Sevi. But the original photograph is very grainy with very little detail. You see there's very little detail around about the eyes, and actually the eyes are very important in any portrait. So the final image is really an amalgamation of a whole range of different photographs, but the main pose is taken from this. Because I'm going to be engraving onto the back of the glass, as you've seen me do before, I would imagine if you've watched any of my videos, I'm going to flip this image over. And then, using the same system I've shown before in other videos, placing that underneath the glass, I can copy the lines, the main lines just, onto the glass, and then go away to the workshop with it. For me, the first stage is always going to be to mark those lines, those initial lines, more permanently onto the glass. This permanent marker, if you start engraving, particularly if you're working wet, the marker sort of floats off the surface of the glass and you lose all the marks you have. So I start usually by taking a white Arkansas stone and going over the main lines so that I can see where I have to do the engraving. If you're going to do a portrait, you have to remember that people are trained from birth to recognise faces. Our brains are so good at seeing faces and recognising them. If you're like me, you can't always put a name to them, but you'll at least recognise the face. That can potentially cause a problem if you're trying to do a portrait, because if you get one little detail wrong, it will jump out and everybody will see it. Because of that, I tend to spend quite a lot of time doing some engraving, which will often obliterate the marks and lines I'd put on the glass, because after all, you're engraving away the surface of the glass. So I then take that back to the original picture, line them up again, and go over again, marking on the next set of lines that I'm interested in from engraving. And the main difference in these repeated remarkings of the glass is that once the first little bit of engraving is done, I can mark these lines on using a pencil. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll take a graphite pencil to mark in where I want to put more shade, and a coloured pencil to mark in where I want to put more highlight in. But it is a repeated process, going back and forward, marking the lines onto the glass, and then going away and doing some engraving. If you watched my video on engraving pet portraits, you might remember I spent quite a lot of time talking about how important it was to get the texture right, to get the flow of the fur. Portraits of people are obviously quite different. There are very different textures involved. When you're engraving the hair, for example, that's actually very similar. We need to look at the way that the hair is lying in the photograph and to copy that movement or flow of the hair in the way that we move the burr across the glass. It's a bit like when you're painting and the brush strokes help to show the texture of what you're painting. In engraving, it's very similar. The way that we move the burr across the surface creates a texture which mimics the texture that we're trying to copy. So doing hair, very much like what I was talking about in pet portraits, you're looking at where the hair lies, the direction it flows across the portrait, and you're trying to copy that with the movement of the burr. Skin generally is obviously quite smooth, so what we're looking to get is a smooth finished texture. To help with that, I've started off, this is actually a new burr that I've been using. I got these from one of my suppliers, and it's a white aluminium oxide, a little bit coarser than an Arkansas stone, but certainly much smoother than a green stone. So using this relatively smooth burr, I can put in the mid-tone of the skin, or at least start to do that. But no matter how careful I am, I'm probably going to end up with some tool marks in this engraving. And I don't want those, not at this stage certainly. I want a smooth texture to mimic the smooth texture of the skin. There are a couple of suggestions I can make on how you can get rid of these tool marks. The first one is to go with a very light hand, to not really press at all hard if you're trying to get a smooth texture. And then to go over it very, very lightly and try to remove any high spots and take away the tool marks as best you can using the rotary tool. That should take you back to a reasonably smooth texture, but if you want to get it even smoother than that and to get rid of as many tool marks as possible, what I normally do is I work by hand, not using the rotary tool. Sometimes using a green stone, more often using wet and dry sandpaper, and rubbing over the areas where I need it to be very smooth, taking out the tool marks and giving me a good basis for the next stage of the engraving. So yes, this is a very much a manual process, and it takes a bit of time, but if you are trying to get down to a smooth texture of the skin, it's worth trying to do that. Having got to a stage where the skin is fairly smooth and I've got most of the tool marks out and I've got the mid-tones of the skin established, the rest of the process is very much standard, looking to areas where we need to have more shade on the skin. Shading is achieved by making the glass smoother. In part, I may have done a bit of that with the wet and dry sandpaper at this point, but largely I will be shading the glass using very smooth stones like a white Arkansas stone and going over it with a variety of rubber polishing bits. The main areas of shade are around about the eyes, underneath the eyes, around the mouth. And the process of shading, I have a whole video about the process of shading, but it's all about smoothing out the surface of the glass again, and the smoother it is, the darker it is. So I achieve that by going over it with a smoother burr and then the rubber polishing bits. Throughout this process I'll be going back and forward to the original photograph. And again, always looking for areas of shading and making sure I get those in. Along with the shade, of course, there are areas of highlight. Particularly in this case on the right hand side of the face, which is much lighter and brighter. To get a highlighted area, I'm trying to get a slightly rougher texture. Also again, hopefully without too many tool marks in there. And the rougher texture I would get with a rougher burr, either a green stone in this case, or a small diamond, a spherical diamond burr. Now this whole process takes quite a long time. I have to do a lot of checking back to the original photograph, putting in shade, putting in shadow areas, going back and picking out highlight areas, and I'll repeat that many times until I get to a stage where I'm happy with the finished outcome. I once had the opportunity to ask Leslie Pike, and if you haven't seen any of Leslie Pike's videos on YouTube, I thoroughly recommend that you have a look at them. She is just a top class engraver. Anyway, I had the chance to ask her once how she went about engraving a black animal, a black dog in that particular case. What she said to me was that she avoids engraving black animals wherever possible because it's quite tricky. When you think about it, when we're engraving, we're making things white. Trying to show something as black can be quite difficult. In this particular portrait, I have several areas which are very dark. Leaving out the shadows around about the eyes and around about the mouth, we've got areas in the hair, and we've also got the woolen jumper, all of which are very dark. I've already talked a bit about engraving the hair and putting the texture into the hair, and all of that is true, but it's been done with quite a smooth burr, a green stone and some white Arkansas stones, and then polished over to give the dark tone to the hair. It's an interesting thing that when you put something dark beside something that's very light, the dark colour always appears darker and the light colour appears brighter. So one trick to use here is to go over the hair and look for areas of highlight and put those in very bright and very light, and that will help to show up the texture in the hair, the structure of the hair, and also paradoxically to make the dark bits appear darker. So engraving dark things is always tricky, but it helps if you can make them appear really shiny and make the highlights really bright. I used a similar technique on the woolen jumper. Now I wanted this to be really dark, so the only thing that the main area of the woolen jumper has been engraved with is a fairly coarse rubber polisher, which obviously leaves you with quite a dark finish. Once again, in order to show up the shape of it, and what I've relied on are the highlights where they appear around the edge of the arm and a little bit where there are little folds in the fabric at the front. So picking out those highlights makes the dark colour of the jumper look a bit more black. I think it was probably navy blue in the original, but anyway, it makes that stand out a little bit more in the engraving. Before finishing engraving the face, I go back over it once more, trying to pick out any shadows or highlights that might need to be improved on. And at this point, I've actually got polishing rubber in my hand, and I'm doing this manually to try and give a very fine gradation in shade on points of the face. I decided I would like to put Sevi's signature onto the glass here, and You'll notice that I'm putting this onto the right side of the glass, the side it's being viewed from, which is why it looks the other way around now. That's because I can't write backwards, so I have to do it on the right side. But I've just copied his signature and taped it onto the back of the glass and engraved it onto the front here. I did add a little bit of gold colour to the signature just to make it stand out a little more, and if you'd like to see how that was done, then just watch the next video. And I think that's all I can usefully tell you on engraving portraits onto glass. I hope you found one or two tips in there that may be useful for you. As always, if there are any subjects you would like me to cover in a video, please leave a comment for me and I'll do my best to help you out. And as always, thank you very much for watching.